Hello, everyone. We'd like to start at this point. First, I'd like to start by thanking our panelists. It's such a huge honor to have them here. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is James Trusock III. I will be the moderator for this panel discussion. Here we have our MSSD alumni who were actually involved in the 1988 Deaf President Now movement. Our first panelist is Karl Ewan. Our next panelist is Michelle Wynn. Next one over is Cindy Officer. And lastly, we have Mark Tao. I'd like to start with our first question. As an MSSD student or staff person, in what year did you graduate, and what is your current position now?
I was in the class of '89. I grew up in the Washington, D. Maryland area. I went to Kendall School, and I now work at Gallaudet University in the Residence Life and Housing Office.
I'm from the class of '89, just like Karl. We actually grew up together. I went to Kendall School as well as MSSD. I'm currently employed in the federal government, working in the Custom Border Patrol, and I work in the mail center. I'm the only deaf employee. I was born and bred in Washington, D.C. I love this city, and I still live here.
Hello, everybody. I was not the class of '89. I was the class of '90. All right. I came into MSSD at the age of 15. I was a sophomore. I grew up in West Virginia, and I was mainstreamed there as the only deaf student in the school, and both my parents were hearing. So I came to MSSD with a little bit of an identity crisis, but I was able to solve that while going here. I work at Gallaudet University in the Professional Studies Coordinator under the Office of Continuing Studies.
I came here to MSSD in 1981. I was born in the country of Taiwan. However, now I live in Virginia. I currently work as an MSSD science teacher. I was not an MSSD student during the DPN movement, but I do feel as if I graduated from MSSD because I feel such a strong bond with all of you.
He was actually my dorm supervisor back in the day.
So I'd like to start with the first question. How did a DPN impact MSSD and the Kendall students, parents, teachers, and staff?
Wow. I was actually living off campus with my parents who are hearing. And it started happening overnight. I got up and got ready to head to school. And when I got here, I saw all of these people lined up outside of the gates. And everybody was yelling, DPN, DPN. And I really had no idea what was going on. And I didn't know what DPN meant. So I continued to walk onto campus. And people started telling me what was going on. And I was a little bit lost, because I lived off campus, so I hadn't been involved in the beginnings of this. But then they started to tell me that it was about the Deaf President Now movement and the demand to have a deaf president as opposed to the long line of hearing presidents that Gallaudet has been subjected to. So again, I continued my walk up to the school and had all of these people telling us, we've got to go support DPN, we've got to get involved in this march, and, we are deaf and we need to be involved. And so that's how it all started.
Wow. I'm sure that each of us can write a book on that experience, and that's a really tough question. But I think that it impacted me in a very specific way. When I came into MSSD, I did not know American Sign Language. I could barely fingerspell. A very sad situation for myself. I used mainly spoken language to communicate. I was happy with the friends that I have, and I was able to survive. My mother was learning sign as well, and I was able to start acquiring sign language, also hearing members of the family. But after DPN occurred, it had a true impact because it changed my entire feeling of myself. Before, I felt that I had to learn ASL as a language, and then I actually took on the deaf identity. And after DPN, my sign language fluency improved. I grew in love for my language, my people, and my culture, and I was able to prove that to my family and friends. And that week was a miracle for me. And again, There's so many stories that are intertwined in that event that I could tell.
I would say that the Deaf President Now movement did have a major impact. We could see the deaf community, deaf adults, deaf students, Gallaudet students, and all of the students here at MSSD and Kendall getting actively involved in this. And what you see is that everyone has a dream, and everyone is dreaming about meeting their goals and having the perseverance to get to where they want to be. And that's a critical piece. We can dream anything, and here at school, you're a student, you can dream about what it is that you want to do and what you want to be. You want to get a high school diploma, and you want to get a job. And so we see that energy here every day, and we saw it at that movement as well, and it's something that I will never forget.
I come from a deaf family. My dad was actually a community leader here in Washington, D.C. He was president of the Deaf Club. He was very involved with the National Association for the Deaf as well. So I was able to see him as a model. And then you also have the impact of DPN. But it's actually part of the work that my father had been doing previous to the event. In the Deaf Club, he was actually advocating for the rights of deaf citizens. And now DPN was able to broaden our view of the world and broaden the world's view of us as well. As a student, I lived off campus at the time. So I didn't usually stay overnight on campus. I actually lived with my parents and commuted back and forth to home. So I was here during the day with my friends and very involved with my community. And then at night, I was back home with my family. It's very true that DPN had an impact on the growth of deaf rights and attitudes towards deaf people, but it also had a huge impact on the friendships and bonds that we were able to create during that week. I have so many friendships that have lasted till this time in MSSD and at Gallaudet University. So to this day, the 4 student leaders who were involved in the DPN movement are actually friends of mine now because of that specific moment in history. I also learned myself that as a deaf person, you will always have to fight. You're going to have to fight for your rights. Because still today, we are in a position where people still look down upon us. Obviously, the situation has improved since 25 years ago, where persons did not understand who we were as deaf people. But we are still fighting for that, and we still have to fight for that, and that's what it means to me today.
I absolutely agree with what Karl just said here. Back then, people didn't really have an understanding of what it meant to be deaf. We knew who we were as deaf people, but we didn't have deaf leaders. We didn't have deaf role models. And we didn't even know how to start our own movement or be activists on our own behalf. And after DPN and seeing those 4 deaf leaders become role models for our community, that really showed every single deaf person that we could do the same thing. That it didn't matter what your skin color was. Diversity was an important piece of this, and that we could look up to those 4 deaf leaders and be proud of them. And be proud out in the world as well. The mainstream world doesn't have an understanding of who deaf people are and what deaf culture is and what the deaf community is. So we have an obligation to roll up our sleeves and really teach people. And DPN was an opportunity to do that, and I think it was a powerful moment in history.
Back then, DPN wasn't about the color of your skin. It was not. It was absolutely about being deaf, no matter what race or ethnicity you were. Whether you were black, white, Asian, or Latino, Jew, it didn't matter what religion you were, if you were Catholic or Protestant or even Buddhist. The most prominent identity at the time was being deaf. And that opened so many opportunities for persons of color as well. Today, those persons have been able to move up in positions and gain status because of it.
And ironically, I can remember, the civil rights movement in the 1960s and all that happened on that behalf. And that group of people actually came and supported us in DPN. They were leaders in their time in the 1960s, and they came here to support the deaf movement as well. They shared their experience, their wisdom, and their history, and they passed that on to us. They opened some doors for us. They took down some barriers for us, and were really behind the DPN movement. And that's hearing people from around the world. And it was really based on their experience in the 1960s and 70s that led them to come and support us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask the next question. How did you hear or find out about the appointing of the next hearing president at Gallaudet?
Actually, I was at home with my parents. And back then, we didn't have these fancy little trinkets that we have today. What we had was the big green monster sitting in our living room. It was one of the old style TTYs. It was incredibly loud. We could hear it when it turned on. It had this giant whirring sound, so we knew somebody was calling us. Had a huge keyboard that you could hear every single click that it made. And so that's what we actually relied on, was the TV news, which at the time, the idea of captioning was really in its infancy, and captioning was sparse and not of high quality. So we tried to rely on the news for the information. But Sunday night we got a phone call that told us about the protest happening on the Gallaudet campus. And we all talked about going, but decided to stay home that night. And then the next day is when I joined in. So I missed out on the happenings of Sunday night. But I kept my TTY on because people were calling all night long to my dad, and he was calling others, and we were trying to keep everybody in the loop to know what was happening.
That was my similar experience. I actually didn't have a TTY in my home because my parents were not deaf, so they didn't understand culturally the importance of that. I actually slept the night and didn't find out till the next morning when I actually went to school that they talked about the DPN movement and that our hearing president was appointed, and a student explained to me what had happened. Sign language was different than my time, so I was able to try to ascertain from some of the older students what was happening, and at that point I started to get involved in the DPN movement, so that's how it happened for me.
That Sunday night, the students who lived in the dorm were called down to the field house on Gallaudet's campus. And the leaders there stood up and announced who was appointed as president. And we all found a stack of papers out in front of the bison statue that's in front of the field house as we were leaving the building. And I remember picking one up, and it was an announcement of the new president. And then I saw someone actually throw a match onto that pile of papers and burn that announcement. And so everyone started talking about running down and closing the gates and blocking it off. And so we actually ran to where the Board of Trustees was sleeping, which was the Mayflower Hotel. We had people lined up there. We had people making signs. There were more and more people heading down there. It was sort of the mob mentality. You know, everyone was just running to join in, and went down to Florida Avenue. And again, many of the MSSD students were in the front because, you know, MSSD students run faster than those college kids did. So we ended up at the front of the lines there and blocked off the gates. And the police came in and tried to open the gate and ended up hitting some students by doing that. And we were surprised that had happened, but we just kept going, you know, and we ran all the way to the Mayflower Hotel, and we sat outside the hotel and demanded to speak with the Board of Trustees. So it really was a big night. I don't actually remember what happened after that, because we went back to the dorm, went to sleep, and then I think the next day the whole campus was locked down, and we didn't even get any breakfast. I do remember that.
Wow. In 1988, you know, we're talking 25 years ago, and time has gone by so quickly in the blink of an eye. I remember actually when I first learned of this movement. At that time, I was working in the dorm. I worked as a dorm supervisor. During the daytime, I would usually stay home, and I believe I saw something announced on the news, and it hadn't really hit me yet about what was happening in the campus. I know they announced that a hearing president was appointed. I reached to work in the afternoon, and that's when the community started telling me about this hearing president being appointed, and the students were very emotional at that time. And the staff, of course, was we were trying our best to provide support for the students, and some of the MSSD students headed over to Gallaudet. I can't remember if we joined in with them or not, but you're right, because during the evening, that's when the huge event occurred, and the gates were locked down, and the fires happened with the burning of the announcement. So the students here at MSSD were very connected to that movement. Everybody was working together in solidarity, and the staff would be there providing assistance and help. And through the entire 7 days, we were there. I will never forget that event.
Wow. Really impressive stories there. Let's see. Our next question here is, what were MSSD parents' reactions to DPN? How did they respond?
My parents, being deaf and having been involved in the DC community, were in support of it, of course. There was no question. They were 100% in solidarity.
You know, my parents, who were hearing, didn't understand what DPN was about. They really didn't have any understanding of deaf culture. You know, I was the only deaf person in the whole family, so I started to get involved and would talk through Leslie, who was one of the teachers at Kendall, and she was explaining about deaf culture and about DPN to my parents. So she helped them to gain an understanding of it. And now my mom is 100% supportive of the whole concept and has been since then.
Leslie Pryor is still here. Great, great teacher, amazing. Yes. My parents, as I mentioned before, my mother is deaf, my father is hearing. I gave them the opportunity to, talk about what that meant, and they had a great conversation, because my family, we do have, in my family, what happens is that usually the hearing persons tend to take the lead, and usually they function as the interpreters and facilitate communication, and they would also facilitate cultural communication between hearing and deaf person. My parents actually wrote a letter to the newspaper objecting, in the West Virginia area, in responding to the DPN movement, because they felt that persons were very condescending to deaf people, saying, "Oh, look at this protest that these deaf people are having," and we felt it was very disrespectful. So my parents actually wrote a letter to the editor, and the editor responded well in support and understanding of their point of view. It's similar to African American experience and civil rights for black people, also rights for women as well. Therefore, my parents had a very complex situation.
Well, my parents lived in Taiwan, and they're both hearing, and they don't really know a whole lot about deaf issues. So when Deaf President Now happened, I told them about it, but they didn't have a whole lot of understanding. Now that summer, I flew back home and was able to explain to them in person. And what they both said was that the college should have a deaf president. It should be run by a deaf person, not by a hearing person. So they were both absolutely 100% in support of the movement, which was amazing and inspirational to me.
Wow. That is fantastic. How did the MSSD teachers and staff get involved in the movement? What were they doing specifically during DPN? Maybe Mark Tao could answer to that.
Yeah, I'd say at that time, the teachers were, I'm not so sure about, but in the dorm, which is where I was involved, I know that during the day we were hearing that students were protesting and refusing to go to class, and then in the afternoon all of the students were headed off somewhere. And so those of us who were staff decided to divide up our responsibilities and head off with various groups of students to help them out with wherever it was that they were going, be supportive, be sort of behind the scenes for them. Because we knew that these students, of course, had a dream. And the word that really comes to mind is perseverance. These students were persevering to pursue those dreams, and we wanted to support that. I also remember there was one day when I got to work, and we found all of the gates closed, locked, and blocked off, so I actually couldn't get into work. And what I ended up doing was parking out on, I think, 7th Street somewhere, and walking in. And I told them that I worked in the dorm, so they allowed me permission to enter, but most people were denied entrance to the campus. But everybody understood that the high school students needed someone in the dorm there to help take care of them, so they let me in. And let's see, there was one day that I joined all the students headed out with the Gallaudet students as well to march to the Capitol. The MSSD students were very eager and highly spirited. And when we got there, the MSSD group lined up and were really leading the movement, talking about the demands for a deaf president. They were very active, making poster boards and banners and doing a lot in a very visual manner to support this. And I think there are pictures of that too. Do you guys want to add anything about that?
I don't know if you remember as well, but the teachers has actually set up different stations where you could write letters to your congressman or congresswoman. You could also write letters to the media, parents, and so on. And then there was another area where they were actually making signs. And also there was a station where you could talk with the teachers from the social studies department to give learning opportunities behind the movement and how this is connected to civil rights and peaceful demonstration, and being able to object peacefully with courage. I don't remember whether or not the dorm staff was there. I do remember we weren't ever alone, and the teachers provided us with activities as well. So yes, all of the professional staff were very involved.
You know, as an off-campus student, we were involved in making protest signs and writing letters to congressmen and whatnot, and involved in a number of different activities. And I think that their experiences really helped us to understand what DPN was all about and get involved. It was very important.
The students, staff, and teachers were very reliant on communication mediums such as word of mouth. You had the persons at Gallaudet that were messengers basically who would come and relay information. Then we're also dependent on those type of communication opportunities, and also the TTY to be able to inform what was happening with different events. During the evenings, we would hand out a huge gym, if you guys remember, huge gym from back in the day. And so that week actually helped all of us to be able to socialize with the university students. And here Gallaudet community became one place where we were all community members. It wasn't that we couldn't fraternize with the university students because before that was prohibited, but now we were able to socialize openly and be able to speak with each other. So that was a wonderful experience, especially for those who lived on campus and those who lived off campus who were in MSSD at the time. In addition to that, we had a very great guy, Frank Turk. He, would be the one to make sure that the MSSD students were involved in the DPN council. And he was able to find the student leaders who had a special band on their arm that indicated that. Greg Leibach, Tim Moreras, Bridget Furl, Jerry Covell. We were very involved with the student leaders and in connection with them as well. Wilson McMillan, I believe, lived on campus, and some of the others as well who helped out. Bob Davila was also living in the 400 block area, right across from the university. So we were always in communication with each other to know exactly what was happening.
I remember that we attended an assembly in the gym, and we're actually voting on choosing the student leaders, and those were the ones that got those armbands that indicated that they were the leader. And it was done through due process.
Yes, we were very engaged and involved with the entire process. DPN was not just a civil rights movement for us, but it was also a civics lesson for us as well.
Outstanding. Some really well-known people were involved in this. Very impressive. Let's move on to our next question. So, how did you feel to have hearing people in support of the DPN movement?
I felt that my identity was validated by them. As I mentioned, I was in an identity crisis. Part of my family was deaf, part of my family was hearing. I was also isolated in a mainstream environment. So instead of the hearing persons taking the lead in our family, I feel like us as deaf family members really took the lead after that.
Yeah, I think it was really great to have deaf people in the lead with hearing people supporting us instead of the way that it traditionally had been where hearing people were speaking for deaf people. So I don't have any strong feelings about that. I think hearing people who are involved in deaf culture and have an awareness about it, who maybe had never taken a deaf studies class because that didn't exist back in the day, they just didn't know what deaf culture was. And so this was an opportunity for us to show them and for them to learn from us.
Back then, we only had this one book called the Deaf Heritage book. That was the one book that we had about our culture and language. and that spoke of the history of the deaf community in the United States up until that point. But from 1998 onward, the writings have changed since then. I mean, now today we have a plethora of publications regarding that subject. In the past, mainstream society, hearing people were taking care of us. It was very much a paternalistic relationship, and they were the ones in the positions of authority. After DPN came into the picture, we were the ones that were able to break through that glass ceiling and take those positions in the community. At that time, the deans were all hearing men, but obviously they did have deaf hearts. They did care for the community and the culture, and that's the most important. So even though they were hearing, their hearts were deaf. For myself, I was happy to have hearing people involved as long as they were able to act as allies and not try to take control of the movement. During that week, many of our allies were also interpreters. The interpreters played a huge role in transmitting our message to the world, and if it weren't for those interpreters, we probably would not have had the success that we had with the protest. In that case, I would like to applaud the interpreters back then and the interpreters that we have in the room today. I want to thank them so much for carrying our message to the world. So an applause for interpreters as well and the work that they do.
Great. It's wonderful to have hearing people involved as well, and it seems like it worked out for the best. Let's move on to question number 7. So how did it feel when you were in the protest? And looking back on it now, do you feel any regrets about what happened? Or basically, what are your feelings when you look back on 25 years ago?
Well, 25 years ago, the lid kind of popped off the can, so to speak, and everything just came overflowing out. I don't look back on that with any regrets whatsoever. We still have a lot of work to do. Obviously, compared to 25 years ago, we have much less than in the past, if you would agree with me. We do have the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have subtitles and captioning. We also have open captioning in the movie theaters. We have access to interpreters in almost any arena of life. We're able to request interpreters. We also have the video relay service with video interpreters. So 25 years ago, we only had the TTY. That was the best technology at the time. And we also had snail mail. Those were really the only ways that we had to communicate. Right now we have smartphones and video conferencing technology. So I think that obviously our situation is much better than back then.
Yeah, and I would add to that and say that we finally had deaf activists. And we now have deaf actors that have come out of this as well. 25 years ago, we didn't have that. And now we have famous deaf actors that are in the limelight, such as Marlee Matlin and others. We now have deaf people who are becoming physicians. We have deaf people who are becoming dentists. We have, this has just opened up career paths for deaf people. 25 years ago, there was this huge sense that deaf people couldn't do things and that they had to sort of sit back in the shadows and not pursue their dreams. But now, deaf people can do whatever it is that they want. They can be supervisors and they can be managers. Maybe there are deaf CEOs. Maybe someday we can have a deaf president. Maybe we've got Obama in office now, but maybe someday in the future we'll have a deaf person in office. So I think that event 25 years ago had a major impact on the last 25 years and will continue to impact our future as well.
To add to that, today when you go to the store, even to the doctor's office, you will notice that they're hearing people who know some amount of sign language, and that's very surprising. There are many public high schools that are now offering American Sign Language as a language elective course, and so we're very grateful for that, and that's inspiring. And 25 years ago, that was not the case, but because of DPN, sign language is much more known and popular today. I have to say that I'm very, very proud of what I have seen. I was a witness to all of these events that occurred. I tell these stories not only to my children, because, we have our deaf president is a president from our community and our culture. I tell these accounts to my children, to my friends, to my family members. And when I go and I fly internationally, I talk about the fact that we have a deaf president in the United States so that they can understand too in those countries, those deaf communities in those countries can understand that there are role models out there in globally. So we really, as a deaf community, are one globally. We're one huge international community.
And I think that it is time for us now that 25 years later we're all adults, and it's time for us to look back on what it is that we learned and to think about the fact that we're now in the year 2013 and it's our turn to pass this obligation on to you as students. The continuation of this movement and the continuation of deaf rights belongs to you now.
So DPN therefore had a huge impact on our deaf community. And now we'd like to open to the audience members to ask questions. Was the first time I actually felt like an adult. I had, had to have courage, make decisions for myself, make decisions regarding my own value system. There were times when, I had to decide when I was going to go to bed on my own, and I had to decide what my beliefs were. Nobody was here to guide me or to tell me what to do. I can't say that I decided to become a doctor on that day, but I did realize that I am a person apart from my family. I could make decisions, speak for myself. So in that sense, it did have an impact on me.
I think I would agree with what Cindy's saying here. It had a huge impact for me. At that time, it was hard to look towards my future. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I was hopeful that I would be able to really roll up my sleeves and accomplish things, to show the world who I am, to learn to be a leader, to learn to be a role model, and to be able to carry that forward. And now, looking back to when I was a kid, and I realized that, just yesterday we were talking about looking back on that experience of 25 years ago and how important it was for us. Again, we mentioned Frank Turk, who was one of those that was really encouraging us to get involved. He encouraged me to go to the youth leadership camp, which I was really nervous to do. I felt like I wouldn't be able to. But Frank really said I should. I asked my parents if I could go, and they were like, youth leadership camp, what is that for? But I did. I ended up going, and I had some hard experiences. It was definitely a learning experience for me, but at the same time, it was an enriching one. I learned about communities. I learned about leadership. I learned about getting along with others, and DPN taught me that as well, and I think it was very much worthwhile.
Yes, I went to the youth leadership camp as well.
I'd say looking back on 25 years, I thought I would go to college at Gallaudet, and then I thought that I might work for Gallaudet, and just have what was sort of expected to be a regular life for a deaf person at the time. But because of DPN, I worked at Gallaudet briefly, but then I left, and I went and worked in the private sector. I worked for Sprint Relay. I worked for VRS companies. I did internships. And I was also a teacher in New York at the Lexington School for the Deaf. And if not for DPN, I don't think that I would have done all of that. I don't think that I would be who I am today. I don't think I would have gone down that path. I think I probably would have just stayed in one job at Gallaudet and sort of settled for the status quo my whole life.
Wow, that's so amazing, the huge impact that DPN movement had on each one of us. Thank you.
Oh, it absolutely did. Each one of us in our own ways.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris. I want to add to question number 7. Wondering if you had any regrets about being involved 25 years ago. Or did things happen the way you thought that they would? Or do you think that there are any regrets that came out of the movement?
You know that during any type of protest or activism, You always have to keep in mind that there may be some regrets. However, with the DPN movement, I do not regret marching. I don't regret, speaking out to those hearing people who were basically ignorant of who we are. I do not regret encouraging my classmates to miss school. I have no regrets whatsoever.
Me neither. I don't regret it. It felt good to tell the world who we were. We didn't have to hold our voices in any longer. DPN was the opportunity for us to break free of that oppression, and it was amazing. It really was, this expression of who we were. And we'd been holding it in for way too long, so I have no regrets about being involved with DPN. I think that it's important that any activism doesn't hurt anyone. It needs to be, nonviolent activism. I believe in Martin Luther King's teaching of using the nonviolent verbal approach to protesting and expressing your feelings. And that's what we did, and so I don't have any regrets about it.
There are 2 points that I like to make. The Monday that we went to the Mayflower, or actually the Sunday night, and then the following Monday morning, we didn't get any food. We couldn't send any mail out. So that part was scary for me. I do admit that. For Monday, the entire day, the protests started to become more organized. Leaders were chosen, and the demands were created as well. And from that point on, it was much better organized. And the MSSD staff, teachers were all there to support us. So yes, Sunday night to Monday morning, it was a scary experience for myself. I will admit to that. I think that one thing that really impressed me and struck me was the meeting area where we would go in Field House. If you could help me to remember, there was an area where you had the Board of Trustees making the announcement. We were sitting in some bleachers, it looked like, and the Board of Trustees, who was it that stood up? I believe it was Harvey Goldstein, who actually were telling us to go. And, we felt that people felt that was disrespectful. He actually came in front of the Board of Trustees and tell everyone to go ahead and leave the room. And we felt like we had to sit there like obedient little children. But when he said, leave, that we felt that we could get up and do it too. And then I felt that I could. So I was able to get out of my box. So those were 2 important points that I think were a little bit frightening for me. But I was able to get over it, and the week continued.
Deaf people experience years of oppression before DPN. Oftentimes we would think that we couldn't do things. But since DPN, deaf people know that they can. We can do things. We can do whatever we want. So I have no regrets about it.
Thank you very much.
All right. I've got to admit, I've got chills from this panel today. It was such an honor to have you all here, and I'm so glad to have heard your words today. I think that the message that we take away from this is that we can do anything. We can accomplish our dreams. So a round of applause for everyone, and thank you all for coming. Let's all give everybody a standing ovation. Let's all say this together. We can do anything. Ready? Join us, everyone. This was our message from last week.